Nigeria is a country that has been blessed with an abundance of natural resources, including oil. However, the exploitation of these resources has come at a great cost to the people of Nigeria. One company that has been at the forefront of this exploitation is Shell. For decades, Shell has been operating in Nigeria, extracting oil and making billions of dollars in profits. But at what cost to the Nigerian people? This is the story of how Shell seized control of Nigeria and its government, so grab a cup of coffee and let's walk you through it. To fully understand this, we will need to go back in time to 1937. In 1937, Shell arrived in Nigeria. The Royal Dutch/Shell Group founded Shell Darcy, the first shell company in Nigeria, and began to explore and extract oil from the country. Since then, the company has become the largest oil producer in Nigeria and one of the largest multinational corporations operating in the country. At first, the Nigerian government and people saw Shell's arrival as a positive development. Oil was seen as a way to bring wealth and prosperity to the country, and the government welcomed Shell's investment and expertise. However, as time passed, it became clear that the benefits of the oil industry were not being shared equally. Oil spills and gas flaring began to ravage the environment, contaminating water sources and destroying crops and fisheries. Communities living near oil fields were subjected to constant noise and pollution, and their homes and land were often seized without adequate compensation. Moreover, Shell was accused of complicity in the human rights abuses perpetrated by the Nigerian government against its own citizens. The situation reached a boiling point in the 1990s when the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, MOSOP, emerged to demand justice for the Ogoni people, whose land had been devastated by oil spills and other environmental damage. MOSOP, led by activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, called for a fair share of the profits from the oil industry and for environmental remediation. Shell was seen as a prime target for their demands, and the company was accused of collaborating with the Nigerian government to suppress the movement. Despite the international outcry against the human rights abuses in Nigeria, Shell continued to operate in the country and extract oil for profit. The legacy of this exploitation is still felt today, with ongoing environmental damage, displacement of communities, and human rights abuses. Shell's presence in Nigeria has had a devastating impact on the environment and the people who rely on it. One of the most significant issues has been oil spills, which have occurred frequently throughout Shell's history in Nigeria. According to the Nigerian government, there have been more than 7,000 oil spills in the Niger Delta region alone over the past several decades. These spills have had a catastrophic effect on the local ecosystem, killing fish and other aquatic life, contaminating the water supply, and destroying farmland. The environmental damage is not just limited to the spills themselves. The cleanup efforts have also caused harm to the environment. In many cases, Shell has used techniques that are harmful to the ecosystem, such as burning the oil off the surface of the water. This has led to the release of toxic chemicals into the atmosphere, which can cause health problems for the people who live in the area. Another significant issue has been gas flaring, which is the process of burning off natural gas that is produced during oil drilling. This practice is both wasteful and harmful to the environment. Gas flaring releases large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, contributing to global warming. It also emits toxic chemicals such as benzene, which can cause respiratory problems, skin irritation, and other health issues. The destruction of ecosystems and wildlife is another issue that has resulted from Shell's presence in Nigeria. The company has cleared large areas of land for oil drilling, destroying the habitat of many species of animals and plants. In addition, the construction of pipelines and other infrastructure has disrupted natural waterways and caused further harm to the ecosystem. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in 1995 when Shell was accused of collaborating with the Nigerian military government in the execution of environmental activist Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other activists who had protested against the company's practices. Saro-Wiwa's execution sparked international outrage and led to increased scrutiny of Shell's activities in Nigeria. The environmental disasters that have occurred as a result of Shell's activities in Nigeria have had a significant impact on the country's people and economy. Fishing and farming, which are essential sources of livelihood for many Nigerians, have been severely impacted by the pollution caused by oil spills. The destruction of the environment has also contributed to the displacement of people from their homes and has had a negative impact on their health. In one interview with a local Emmanuel Ayodele, community leader said when Shell first came to their community, they were promised development and progress. But instead, they got devastation. The oil spills had destroyed their farmland and contaminated their water sources. Their people had lost their livelihoods and were left to suffer the consequences of Shell's greed. In an interview with Esther Kiobol, a human rights activist, she said, she lost her husband, Baranem, because of Shell. He was a peaceful activist fighting for their rights and the environment. But Shell saw him as a threat and worked with the Nigerian government to falsely accuse and execute him. It was a clear message to others who dared to stand up against them. In another interview with Nimobasi, an environmental activist, he said, "The gas flaring in the Niger Delta is a crime against humanity. It causes respiratory diseases, acid rain, and climate change." Shell and other oil companies have been flaring gas for decades, despite the fact that it's illegal and harmful to people's health and the environment. They demanded that they stop this practice and take responsibility for the harm they have caused. Shell's presence in Nigeria has had a devastating impact on the environment and the people who depend on it. The oil spills, gas flaring, and destruction of ecosystems and wildlife have caused immeasurable harm to the Niger Delta region and its people. It is essential that companies like Shell are held accountable for their actions, and that measures are taken to protect the environment and the rights of local communities. Shell's presence in Nigeria has been marked by more than just environmental disasters. The company has also been accused of perpetrating egregious human rights abuses against the Nigerian people, particularly in the Niger Delta region where the majority of Nigeria's oil is located. One of the most widespread abuses has been forced evictions. Shell has been accused of forcibly removing entire communities from their land in order to make way for oil exploration and extraction. One such community is the Ogoni people, who were forced to leave their land in the early 1990s after protesting against the company's presence. To this day, many Ogoni people are still displaced and have not been able to return to their homes. Violence against protesters has also been a common occurrence. In 1995, the Nigerian military cracked down on protests in the Ogoni region, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of people. Shell was later accused of colluding with the military and providing them with financial support and transportation. More recently, in 2020, Shell was implicated in the shooting of peaceful protesters at the Lekki toll gate in Lagos. The protesters were demonstrating against police brutality and the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, SARS, but were met with violence by security forces. Evidence has since emerged suggesting that Shell provided logistical support to the security forces involved in the shooting. Shell has also been accused of contributing to the rise of paramilitary groups in the Niger Delta. These groups, which are often armed, have been responsible for a range of human rights abuses, including kidnapping, extortion, and murder. Shell has been accused of providing support to these groups in order to protect its operations in the region. The impact of these human rights abuses on the Nigerian people has been devastating. Forced evictions have left many communities without homes or sources of livelihood. Violence against protesters has resulted in the loss of countless lives, and the rise of paramilitary groups has made life in the Niger Delta increasingly dangerous. Despite these abuses, Shell has largely avoided accountability. The company has been accused of using its considerable political influence to avoid prosecution and maintain its operations in Nigeria. The Nigerian government has also been criticized for failing to hold the company accountable for its actions. In recent years, however, there has been growing pressure on Shell to take responsibility for its role in the environmental and human rights crisis in Nigeria. Activists and civil society organizations have called for the company to pay reparations to affected communities, clean up the damage caused by its operations, and invest in sustainable development projects in the Niger Delta. Shell's presence in Nigeria has been marked by environmental disasters and egregious human rights abuses. The company has been accused of forcibly removing communities from their land, colluding with the military, and contributing to the rise of paramilitary groups in the Niger Delta. The impact of these abuses on the Nigerian people has been devastating, and there has been growing pressure on Shell to take responsibility for its role in the crisis. It is crucial that we continue to shine a light on the situation in Nigeria and hold companies like Shell accountable for their actions. In the early years of Shell's presence in Nigeria, the government was largely supportive of the oil industry and viewed it as a means of boosting the country's economy. However, over time, this relationship has become increasingly complicated, with allegations of corruption, collusion, and human rights abuses on both sides. One of the key ways in which Shell has benefited from its relationship with the Nigerian government is through the lack of regulation and oversight of the oil industry. Despite numerous environmental disasters and human rights abuses, the government has failed to hold Shell accountable and has instead allowed the company to continue operating with impunity. Furthermore, Shell has been accused of using its significant financial resources to influence government officials and gain preferential treatment. This has included making large donations to political campaigns and parties, as well as offering bribes and kickbacks to officials in exchange for favorable treatment. On the other hand, the Nigerian government has also benefited from its relationship with Shell, primarily through the revenue generated by the oil industry. However, this revenue has not been distributed fairly and has instead been concentrated in the hands of a small group of elites, while the majority of Nigerians continue to live in poverty. The government has also been accused of colluding with Shell to suppress dissent and opposition to the oil industry. This has included the use of violence against protesters and the forced eviction of communities living in oil-rich areas. Overall, the relationship between Shell and the Nigerian government has been a complex and problematic one. While both parties have benefited from their association, it has come at a great cost to the Nigerian people and the environment. The lack of accountability and regulation has allowed Shell to operate with impunity, while the government has failed to protect the rights of its citizens and instead prioritized the interests of the oil industry. It is clear that significant changes are needed to ensure that the oil industry in Nigeria is held accountable for its actions, and that the government is working in the best interests of its people. Despite the challenges they face, many communities and individuals in Nigeria have taken action against the negative impact of Shell's activities. These efforts have taken various forms, including legal action, protests, and community organizing. One notable example is the case brought by the Ogale community in the Niger Delta against Shell in 2016. The community alleged that Shell had contaminated their water sources with oil spills, causing widespread health problems and environmental destruction. In 2021, a UK court ruled in favor of the community, ordering Shell to pay compensation and take action to clean up the pollution. Another example is the Niger Delta Avengers, a militant group that emerged in 2016 with the aim of disrupting oil production in the region as a form of protest against Shell and other multinational corporations. The group has claimed responsibility for a number of attacks on oil facilities, resulting in a significant decrease in Nigeria's oil production and highlighting the need for greater accountability and environmental protection. At the grassroots level, many communities have also taken action to resist Shell's activities. For example, in the village of Ikebiri in the Niger Delta, residents organized a protest against Shell's pipeline construction, which they argued threatened their land and livelihoods. Despite facing intimidation and violence from both Shell and the Nigerian military, the community continued to resist and eventually succeeded in halting the construction. In addition, a number of civil society organizations in Nigeria have been working to advocate for environmental justice and hold Shell accountable for their actions. These include organizations such as Environmental Rights Action, which has been instrumental in raising awareness of the environmental and human rights impacts of oil extraction in the Niger Delta. Overall, the activism and resistance against Shell's activities in Nigeria demonstrate the strength and resilience of communities in the face of corporate and government abuse. While the struggle for justice and accountability is ongoing, these efforts offer hope for a more just and sustainable future for all Nigerians. The impact of Shell's activities in Nigeria has not gone unnoticed by the international community. Non-governmental organizations have been at the forefront of efforts to raise awareness about the negative effects of Shell's operations on the environment and local communities. Non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International, Friends of the Earth, and Greenpeace have conducted investigations, released reports, and organized protests to pressure Shell to take responsibility for the harm caused by their operations. In addition to non-governmental organizations, governments have also taken action to address the situation in Nigeria. The European Union has implemented regulations requiring companies to disclose payments made to foreign governments for the extraction of oil, gas, and minerals. This has brought increased attention to the issue of transparency in the oil industry and the need for greater accountability for companies like Shell. The United States government has also been involved in addressing the issue. In 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the Kiobel v. Royal Dutch Petroleum case that foreign corporations could be held accountable for human rights abuses committed outside of the United States. This decision opened the door for victims of human rights abuses in Nigeria to bring lawsuits against Shell in U.S. courts. International bodies such as the United Nations have also been involved in addressing the situation in Nigeria. In 2011, the United Nations Environmental Program released a report detailing the extent of environmental damage caused by oil spills in the Niger Delta. The report called for a $1 billion fund to be established to address the damage caused by the spills and to provide compensation to affected communities. Although Shell agreed to contribute $200 million to the fund, the implementation of the recommendations has been slow. The role of international financial institutions in supporting Shell's operations in Nigeria has also been a subject of scrutiny. The World Bank has provided financial support for various projects related to the oil industry in Nigeria, including the construction of pipelines. However, these projects have been criticized for their lack of transparency and for failing to adequately address the concerns of affected communities. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to divest from fossil fuels, which has included calls for divestment from companies like Shell. This movement has gained traction among universities, religious organizations, and other institutional investors, who are increasingly recognizing the environmental and social costs associated with investments in the fossil fuel industry. Shell's presence in Nigeria has had a devastating impact on the country, particularly in the Niger Delta region. The oil industry has led to widespread environmental destruction, including oil spills, gas flaring, and the destruction of ecosystems and wildlife. The local communities that rely on the natural resources of the region have suffered immensely as a result, with devastating impacts on their health, livelihoods, and cultural heritage. Moreover, the human rights abuses perpetrated by Shell in Nigeria have been nothing short of shocking. Forced evictions, violence against protesters, and collusion with the Nigerian military have become commonplace. The Nigerian government has been complicit in allowing Shell to operate in the country, benefiting from the corporation's activities while ignoring the devastating impacts on local communities. Despite this, the Nigerian people have shown remarkable resilience and resistance in the face of Shell's activities. Activists, community leaders, and non-governmental organizations have fought tirelessly to bring attention to the issues and hold Shell accountable for their actions. Their bravery and determination have been an inspiration to many and have led to some positive developments, including increased attention and pressure from the international community. International non-governmental organizations, governments, and bodies, such as the United Nations, have also played a critical role in addressing the issues faced by the Nigerian people. The international community has put pressure on Shell and the Nigerian government to take responsibility for their actions and to work towards a more just and sustainable future for the country. It is essential to hold multinational corporations accountable for their actions, particularly in countries with weak governance structures. Shell's activities in Nigeria have highlighted the need for greater transparency, accountability, and responsibility from corporations operating in developing countries. It is vital that we learn from the struggles of the Nigerian people and work towards a just and sustainable future for all.